All right, here we are. We're at chapter 9 of Thomas and Sosin. We begin with the five-stage, or the phases of AIM, the Abide in Me model. Phase 1, connection and assessment, and this is explained in greater detail in the text. But essentially with connection and assessment, you're establishing safety, and then also figuring out why are we here? What are the expectations? We talked a little bit about goal planning in the previous chapter, so we have to understand how long it would take, as we plan right from the very first session, termination, and what that will look like. How will we know when we achieve success? The counselee must also understand why you need to ask certain questions. Sometimes questions that might be appropriate are, mental health questions. If someone's telling you that they're feeling depressed, what does that mean? What does it mean to say, oh, I'm depressed? Are we talking clinical depression, mild dysthymia? Is it just experiential anhedonia? Are they feeling sad? Are they feeling bummed, down? Have they been treated or taken medications before for depression? Is it depression that they're saying, I think I'm depressed because that's what their friends say, or is it clinical depression that's been formally diagnosed? So it's important to ask those kinds of questions and to explain why you might need to clarify. The first session and the first few subsequent sessions are dedicated really to trying to get the psycho-spiritual assessment underway, so that you're thinking, are there any mental health issues? What are their thought processes? Social type things, do you have any family, friends, others in the church? Who can you count on for support? All those things are really important. Who's going to help you and walk alongside you as you make these changes? And then spiritually, the assessment that you're doing, how close are they? Are they a Christian? Are they close to the Lord? If they're maybe backslidden, or things that you might want to know that are going to give you some strength to move forward in the process. Phase 2, conceptualization and treatment planning. It's significantly impacted by theoretical orientation. So earlier in the course, there's some different theories that you've worked through. Certainly coaching takes a very cognitive, goal-directed process. When we're working with someone, we define what are the goals that they want to work with, and then that helps us to determine the direction we're going. Synthesize all the data, conceptualize it to their situation. And it's also based on the assessment data that you collaboratively form with the person that's sitting in front of you. Remember that assessment is ongoing, so it's not really one thing that we do at the beginning and then kind of check it out on autopilot, but we're always taking information that's going to help us as we're helping someone. Phase 3 is treatment. It's the most active and the emotionally intense phase itself. You might not call it treatment in pastoral or ministry-based counseling, but it's really the work. That might be another way to think about it. This is really doing the work of, we've established a goal, and now we're moving towards helping that goal to be completed. It's the heart and soul of the counseling process, and the success itself is related to not only your skill in putting these things into practice, but their willingness to work. There's the old psychologist joke: how many psychologists does it take to change a light bulb? Dramatic pause. The answer is 1, but the light bulb has to want to change. And the same is true with treatment itself. So as long as someone is willing to work and really invest in the process, then it can be quite an effective process. But if somebody doesn't want to change, even a very skilled counselor or minister is going to have a challenging time helping to get someone to point B from point A. Phase 4 is termination, and we covered that in detail in the last lecture. So agreed upon goals, and you must prepare and ease the counselee in the process. Phase 5, post-treatment or aftercare. And for most of us in ministry, this is really where we're going to spend most of our time. Sometimes there are people that we know previously before we've worked with them in a counseling or coaching context, and maybe we have a relationship with them after the official counseling or coaching phase is done. So it might be friends or parishioners that will walk alongside. It's important to remember too that as Christians, we'll spend eternity with these folks as well in Christ's presence. So Post-treatment really is most of our time with an individual. Continue to use strategies and methods as appropriate, and then if there's an aftercare plan. So the intake session, how do we manage this session? Making contact, chit-chat, grounding, and really giving some parameters around here's what we're going to be doing. Some of those things as well when I'm making contact. I go into the ethics. What we talk about is confidential, it's private. Certainly if you're in a position of teaching or preaching, you want to clarify that whatever we talk about here is not is not open for examples from the pulpit. I'm not going to talk to other people. If you're married, there's certain things that are probably not appropriate to share with your spouse as well, where it might be a boundary or something that you're just afraid, this is something that we're going to talk about, in session, and you might want to judiciously share information and leave some details out if you think it could be shared inappropriately. So whatever the situation, you want to make sure that you're sharing that in a way that that is ethically sound. Purpose, what is the goal in coming to counseling? Exploration, assess, explore themes, provide insight, maybe even diagnosis or etiology, cover the assessment in the following chapter where that moves ahead, and also wrapping up, creating a transition to say, as we're approaching the end of counseling or coaching, what's next for us? What's the next thing that needs to happen before we move ahead? Some of these things I'll go through fairly quickly because it is in the text. So addressing interpersonal agreements, again, with somebody that you're meeting with, setting up those parameters and boundaries around what's shared, not shared. Know that in many states you are a mandatory reporter. Know what your laws are in your state. In Michigan, where I'm a licensed counselor and also where Grace Bible College is physically located, pastors, clergies, professional counselors, psychologists, social workers, we're all under the same laws that we're required to report suspected child abuse or neglect. And it's actually, in Michigan, a 93-day misdemeanor, up to a $500 fine for us not to report suspected child abuse or neglect. So it's a pretty significant issue if I'm counseling somebody, even in a church context, and they're telling me something that alludes to child abuse. And for me not to report that is potentially jail time for me. It's a misdemeanor offense. At the same time, that's not probably the best witness for our ministry if I end up either not reporting when I should or keeping something private when a child is being abused. So certainly we're under a legal and ethical obligation to handle that information appropriately. So know what your legal requirements are in your state. The same could be true of vulnerable elder abuse. If someone has elderly parents or grandparents and you have reason to believe that an elderly person is being abused, all states have some kind of reporting requirements, so know what they are in your state. Counseling. Counselees need to know what to expect, boundaries of the process, the nature of counseling or coaching. For those in ministry, you might want to consider what is our policy on church discipline. If something is shared in confidence, and I'm maybe in a pastoral role or a ministry role, is that ever subject to church discipline? It could be like the case that I had of a minister who was involved in an extramarital affair. Is that something that we can talk about privately? Or is that something that needs to be disclosed to a spouse if it hasn't been? Is it something that needs to be reported to at least the elders or the board of directors of a church or whatever your polity structure, usually elders, deacons? How do we handle that? And that's something that you might need a policy around when you're working in counseling or coaching type situations. So that's all informed consent. Counseling, coaching is voluntary. Rights and risks, confidentiality and the exceptions to confidentiality, discussion of your approach and how do you handle coaching or counseling, financial issues. Most churches, if it's a licensed counselor, will often have some kind of a financial arrangement. Many in ministry-based counseling or coaching may or may not charge. That's really something that you'll have to determine and then share with those that you work with. And is there a cancellation policy? I'm happy to come in and meet with you, but I do charge a fee if for some reason you don't call me and it's not a good reason and I had to drive in and sit here and twiddle my thumbs while I waited for you. So it's important to clarify those things. Your credentials, professional affiliations, that might be something that someone you're meeting with would want to know. If you're working in a counseling or ministry profession, they may want to know, are you licensed? Are you ordained? If you're coaching, are you a certified coach? Where is your certification through? Is it empowerment coaching? Is it Christian coaching? What kind of training have you had? Those are all fair questions that someone could ask. Whether supervision's occurring. So if you're meeting with someone, is there another person on the pastoral staff? Maybe you're an associate pastor, and do you share things that you talk about with the senior pastor? Or if you're in a counseling situation or a coaching situation, do you have a mentor coach that you meet with that you talk about details? And also, what about prayer? Christian psychologist Mark McMinn has written quite a bit on prayer. And for some people, perhaps those who have left the church and come back, people have unfortunately gotten burned or felt burned by the use of prayer, where prayer chains may be little more than gossip chains. Let's pray for so and so because she's really struggling, and keep her in your prayers because this happened, or let's pray for so and so. And sometimes people feel like prayer is a wonderful thing, but if it's not done judiciously, even in a counseling or coaching context, people, depending on their background that they bring to that process, it can trigger an emotional reaction. It's just something to be aware of. So establishing goals. Remember that we're working for the counselee or the coachee, not ourselves. We're there to serve. Goal setting is really a key task of phase 2 in the AIM model. And also, counseling and coaching is really about change. That's the purpose. So there's no purpose to come together and leave the same way that we came in. But if we can help people to make positive change, goal-directed change, Christ-focused change, then that is success. Key question. What does the counselee want to change? And that's important. Again, when we talk about stages of change, if they don't want to change something, then it's not going to change. There can also be a discrepancy between what we want to happen. Maybe we want someone to be more godly. We're seeing some behaviors that maybe need to be addressed. But if they're not ready to do that, then that may not happen. Also with families or couples, why are you here? Well, my wife wants me to stop drinking. My husband wants me to quit spending so much. Whatever the issue is, if they're not on board and they're still in a state of pre-contemplation or contemplation, change will likely be short-lived. So we want to make sure we can get behind that. Helper's role must be competent in helping them achieve the goals and be very clear about what we're able and willing to do. We need to help with the stated problem or the goal. Can't contaminate the counseling process with issues from our own life. So realize that sometimes we come into the counseling or coaching process with our own baggage that influences what we're maybe what we see. Immediate, intermediate, and ultimate goals. Really at the end of the day, the best case success in counseling is salvation. If someone doesn't know the Lord, that's probably the best possible goal in leading someone to Christ. But being reconciled with God, becoming like Christ. So we're talking ultimately about sanctification. And as long as our goals and our counselee's goals align with being reconciled to God, then sanctification is part of that process. Good goals are specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and they have a timetable. So when are we going to achieve this by? This is also talked about to some degree in both books, actually, and you'll see this in a lot of the literature online. Initially came through the military, and now it's in pretty common parlance in a lot of the leadership, counseling, and coaching literature out there. In goal, some of the guidelines ground the counselee to the rationale. So it's important to know the why. If you're not behind the why or the motivation, then it's really hard to make positive change. Determine the counselee's desired outcome. So what does the end look like? Sometimes in counseling we'll ask the miracle question, describe for me what would happen if, and you describe exactly what would happen if this change had already happened. And then that gives you something to work toward. Assess the counselee's ambition for the goal. Is this something that they're really committed to and they want to work for? And also link the goal to the strategy that you're using. So those are important steps. When we set an agenda, it's important to do that every session. So what do we hope that's going to happen today? And it gives focus to the session. It's not bad to have an icebreaker or discussion, what they call chit-chat at the beginning of a session. How you doing? How was your week? How are the kids? But then, so what do you hope to achieve today? What are we going to accomplish in this session? And that gives focus, and then we ground that back to the initial goals from the first session. What's the most important thing that you want to talk about? So guidelines, have an invitation. What do you want to work on today? If it's driven by the counselor or the coach, then again, the counselee or the client is not fully behind it most of the time. So we want to give them an invitation. Specificity, the commitment to address the problem. So this is something I want to work on, then that's what we're going to do. Troubleshoot, to identify the nature of the problem. Have the openness and readiness to address the problem. So really, nothing's off the table. If it's something they want to work on, we're going to do it within reason. Again, you'll have a sense of your own willingness and ability to track with certain kinds of problems or issues, as well as then a plan to address the problem. And we might need to decide, is this something that I refer for? If someone says I want to work on just being closer to the Lord, but it comes out, one of the things that really keeps me from being closer to the Lord is I experienced this trauma, I was assaulted, I was abused, and I'm really having difficulties at night. I have bad dreams, flashbacks, trauma reactions, and it's really kind of limiting someone's life. Then you might want to refer to a professional where you feel like, okay, yeah, I can handle the spiritual and strategies for kind of issues of faith, but if it's more trauma type things, PTSD, you probably want to refer to a professional counselor. The Thomas and Sosin kind of have the idea of counselor coach as prophet, priest, and king, and there's some good things in there that's also in the book. Different functions, purpose, emphasis, how we're perceived by a client, what we offer at that time, the goal, and the key strategies. So really, again, these are roles, and there might be an appropriate time for any one of the three as we bring those in. And they initially take that from Larry Crabb and Dan Allender. And then they also go into detail in the Abide in Me model. So that's really a good strategy, a good model to think through how do we best help people. As I end here, I wanted to spend a moment on Boundaries by Cloud and Townsend. I'll make sure this is available in the in Blackboard. So thinking about boundaries, and if you don't have this book, it's an exceptional read. You're probably reading a lot now anyway with the courses, but if you haven't read this yet, it's one that, as opportunities allow, certainly pick up this book, get it on your shelf. It's going to help you a lot. So they use the idea of boundaries in the physical world. We know what that is. There's the old saying that good fences make great neighbors. And it's important to know, where does my property end and your property begin, and vice versa. If I start coming over and I build a shed in your backyard where I want to store my mower, you're not going to be a happy camper. So boundaries are available in the physical world, and they're a good thing. Personal space as well. I wouldn't walk into your house and open the fridge and grab some food and start eating it, and then kick my feet up on your coffee table if I didn't know you or at least have a relationship. So it defines property and ownership. Intangible boundaries are less easy to define, but they increase love and balance, and they help guard and maintain the soul. And part of our having parameters around sessions and having healthy relationships is really healthy boundaries, and putting those things into figuring out what's me and what's not me. Some of the examples of boundaries, and you can read this on your own as you go: skin, personhood, words, truth. God is very clear about truth and falsehood. That's a boundary. Geographical distance, time, emotional distance. Sometimes there's people that I love them, I pray for them, but I need time away from them. And I put a very careful boundary around people who are toxic or emotionally unhealthy in a way that they're not willing to change. And sometimes an emotional distance, a physical distance can be a healthy step. Consequences are a form of boundary. Consequences let people know the seriousness of the trespass and the seriousness of our self-respect, or living within God's values. And these things are important. Christian boundaries, behaviors, that behaviors themselves have consequences. If you study hard, you get good grades. If you work, you receive a paycheck. And on the flip side, there's negative consequences that express themselves in the real world as well. Choices, taking responsibility. So it's important that we do that, our clients do that, our parishioners do that, people that we love. We do that as well with our kids. If this, then that. In legal terms, they call it a quid pro. So a quid pro quo is just that. If this, then that. And it's often in the context of relationship. If you do this, then I'll do that. But really, boundaries and behaviors and consequences all come out in a certain way. Choices, values, limits, thoughts, desires, and even love, our ability to give and receive love, is based to some degree on boundaries. So I'll make sure that that's included in our course as well, so that you have access to that. And that is the conclusion of this lecture.